Hello, everyone, and welcome to the War Report. Now, we're going to do things a little differently. We're actually going to close out with our news on Syria and Libya because a lot has been going down there, but we're going to start out with a bit of a more mundane story that the U.S. Navy wants more ships but cannot afford them, say, military officials. Now, the plan is over the next 10 years to increase the U.S. fleet to 355 ships as opposed to the current 294. Now, that would see 11 ships over the next 5 years would be their plan, and that would bring the force, of course, to 305 ships by 2025, 2026. But apparently, part of the plan is they are slashing 10 ships from that, which bring it down to 345, and their ultimate goal is to have this all done in a decade by 2030. But this is probably the first time in quite some time, several decades, in which the U.S. military has actually taken budget constraints into consideration because you hear the old cliches about how high the defense budget is. Well, look at how many hundreds of billions the defense budget is. It's eventually going to get to a trillion. When's it going to stop? Which I am sympathetic to many of those claims. I think the U.S. spends way too much on its military budget. Now, granted, that comes with having to defend all of Europe and half of Asia, which, again, I think everyone here knows my thoughts on American security commitments around the world, but I'll save that for a later date. But this also plays into some of their weapons programs going into the Columbia class missiles, which are supposed to rival the Russian hypersonic missiles and the Chinese hypersonic missiles, and how budget constraints have affected that, and they have to redirect funds from actual shipbuilding to missile construction. And this, like I said, is the first time in a while where I don't know, since the Cold War, where the United States actually said, well, we have to reconsider some things on military spending. And I know this may be reading too much into it because ultimately they only cut 10 ships from the budget, but this looks like the beginning of the end of an empire. Now, we talk about declining U.S. influence and the role America plays in the world and how that's changing over time, how we're starting to see a more multipolar world rising, but for the first time, we're seeing it actually be affected within the administration of the U.S. military.
Right. I don't like you. I don't want to read too much into it, but just to put some things into perspective as to where America is going, socially speaking, politically speaking, culturally speaking, and that is to compare America, say, at the height of the space race, the Apollo missions, the missions to the moon, and so on. America invested at its time, it was very significant, $5 billion for the mission to the moon. Nowadays, it's about 15 billion, sorry. However, healthcare is already at $500 million, and it's expected to increase. So, especially with the lack of wages increasing, people are going to come to expect healthcare, amongst other services, but especially healthcare, as a service that can be provided vis-a-vis tax dollars, because obviously corporations are not willing to increase wages. And many of the populations that they are bringing in order to suppress wages expect some kind of free healthcare. This is not, I mean, personally, I don't disagree with this. I think that's good policy for just about any nation. But that's just to put into perspective. And as you say, so they're scrapping about 10 ships. It's not that big a deal. No one can even remotely challenge. If they took away 20, no one could challenge America's Navy. However, on a boat versus boat basis. However, as you mentioned, hypersonic missiles are challenging them. And it is making some of the craft obsolete. Now, a lot of these ships are actually really old, and they're still serviceable. However, they're aging, and they're not even with retrofitting various new technologies, the kind that we see on jet fighters, where they receive a new radar system, for instance, night vision capabilities, and so on, and better missile guiding systems that are retrofitted onto jets that were designed in the late 70s, early 80s. Nonetheless, you know, there's only so much you can do, and especially with older vessels that uh, send out very strong radar signals. So yeah, there is a cutback. How what will happen? I think we have to watch. Will probably be some arguments in the Congress about passing these or finding other methods. Uh, and we'll also have to watch and see what China does. China's economy is slowing down. Will it slow down its rapid advancement in both production and technology in their warfare department, if you will? 2020 is going to be an interesting year to see if where and if those trends begin.
Yes, and in terms of military technology capabilities, that I'd keep my eye more on Russia because I'm not saying it's like the 70s, like the 60s and 70s, where China would just copy Russian military technology, but they still get a lot of their cues from Russian weapons manufacturers. And uh, like I said, it's not like a direct line like it was, but a lot of the designs are similar, which complicates things when you consider how many joint projects Russia and India have developed, especially on missiles. And to bolster your point, conventionally the American Navy stands without any challenge. But for those of you who saw the war games, I believe in 2017, 2018, they ran a few where in the Baltic Sea, the U.S. lost horribly to Russia. In the South China Sea simulation, the U.S. lost horribly to China due to the hypersonic missiles. And that was including all of America's top craft, aircraft carrier, cruisers, battleships, all those sort of things, submarines. And they really were completely outdone by, again, Russian Chinese missile technology. And also, to return to your point, yes, especially as America grows more diverse and as it becomes more of a regular political talking point, with people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, as we might get into some of the primary stuff. People are going to want more social spending, which will inevitably hit the military budget. That's where a lot of these Democrats talk about it. And I'm not saying Bernie Sanders will be president, but eventually, within the next few years, maybe it's after Trump, maybe it's after whoever succeeds Trump, another Republican. But the next Democratic president is most likely going to hold at least Bernie Sanders' economic views on healthcare and social services. Maybe not some of his other ones, but again, it's becoming mainstream within the Democratic Party for a more socialized healthcare system, for again, just more paid benefits, whether that be family leave or education costs. Where, yeah, you can almost guarantee the next Democratic administration. Now, of course, that would require House, Senate, and White House. They're going to cut into the military budget for social programs, which I don't necessarily have a problem with, but if you want to maintain this global empire, it does come to a bit of a head. And that'll also be interesting to see how it affects Europe, where a lot of Europe is still under the American security umbrella. If America starts to redirect its military spending to more social spending, uh, I'm curious to see how like the countries in Scandinavia react, how Germany and France, all these other countries with high social spending react. If there, are we going to see a military buildup in Europe? Possibly, but again, that's speculating all over the place. And I think this is a sign of the times to come. Like I said, not to read too much into this, but I wouldn't be surprised even if you saw some Republicans and you see some budget hawk Republicans, maybe like a Rand Paul, who wants to cut both the social spending and the military spending, which I think kind of the social spending, again, not to get on too much tangent, is completely politically unpalatable right now. But I think at some point you're going to get even quite a few Republicans saying it's time to cut military spending, it's time to cut some of our commitments. And I said for a while that if anything's going to bring down the American empire, it's going to be budget constraints. But I figured, of course, American can print money, they control the global currency, they can keep selling much longer than traditionally other empires had. For example, the Soviet Union or the British and French empires. But it looks like I think they can still outlast those other ones, but we're seeing for the first time that the American empire is not infinite.
Right, and it, in a way, as in Europe, both America and well, much less so America, but let's say North America. But I'm really only speaking about the States and Canada, but in Europe as well, and far more so, where by 2050, somewhere between 32 to 36 million people are expected to enter. Sorry, I think it's like 54 million. So on the one hand, they're constrained by our notions about capitalism, our notions about uh, economies, and how the market will write everything itself out. In a way, that idea, which began even in the early 19th century, that market forces was like this computer algorithm that would like fix all kinds of problems that we wouldn't know how to. And so here we are now, where we're indebted to this market. So all the kind of notions that we had about society and money and capitalism, such as one that had been present in human civilization all across the globe, which was that one day of the week you do not work. There's no commercial activity for one day of the week. Now, this was mostly in agrarian societies, and a lot of this began to change with the Industrial Revolution. But what it did is it stored up, for instance, resources, everything from just labor to actual resources, gold, what have you, in order to be able to survive anything from an invasion to an ecological catastrophe and so on, right? But what that did is it created a very different sense about the relationship between a society and its economy. And once we got rid of the bar that we had on Sunday shopping, that accelerated capitalism. And so what's happened is it became the platform for this idea that the economy has to grow. The economy, in a sense, has become a shark. If it doesn't swim, it's going to sink. And so this is why there's like this panic, this need with, technocrats, left wingers, Brussels bureaucrats, even in London. This won't change. The UK leaving the EU is not going to change this dynamic. And that is this need for constantly new shoppers, new workers. They're terrified of demographic decline, and so they all must be replaced. And that's stressing the system out. And America, too, has, at least part of it, has aspirations to get to 500 million people. I think definitely before the 21st century, in order to be able to compete. And so, so there's this marketplace, all these other places that have had relatively much fewer people that have been able to compete, with tariffs and whatnot, and sometimes outright military. Now are playing the game of these massive markets that never sleep. Well, it's not going to be easy to keep up with countries like China and India that have absolutely massive populations. And so these aspirations are now putting a strain on military hardware and security apparatuses. And I think that's what we're looking at. That, to me, is the axle. That's where this is the pivot point. This is the crux of the matter.
Absolutely. I mean, just the era of uncontested neoliberalism that began in the 1980s saw skyrocketing GDP, skyrocketing like business profits, Now, of course, that didn't trickle down as some people told us it would, but it's eventually going to come crashing down. And like you said, that's compared to places like China and India, who have the population just within their own borders already to sustain that, and even places like Russia and some other Eastern European countries where they value more of a steady growth that's proportional with the population that they already have, rather than again the super like endless growth like the shark you said. And we're gonna come to a head, and we're gonna see which system has more longevity. And I think we all know the answer to that. I mean, despite the demographic problems of even countries like China, countries like India, and countries like Russia, that I don't want to hype up their systems too much. I don't want to act like they have it all figured out. But it seems like for the most part, they've sort of tweaked the system where the economy follows the will of the population rather than the population following the will of the economy, which is what we have in our modern system. Now, of course, Tucker Carlson has touched on this, several other people have had. But yeah, it is interesting how these start to really constrain military apparatuses, security apparatuses, and ultimately global influence. And almost it exposes neoliberalism as a self destructive system. Look, every system has a shelf life, but it's usually outdone by other forces or outside forces. But neoliberalism, especially, I'm not saying it's the only one, but at least in our era, is the one that will undo itself as fast as it made itself.
Right, right. I mean, you could, there's a parallel where um, the softening and the feminization of the West, which is by and large self-inflicted, um, creates, for instance, militaries that are that eventually compromise themselves. Uh, the rapid change in demographics also bring into question ideas of loyalty. We've seen consequences already for a few decades concerning that, and yet, the market dictates that this is what it needs. And on the one hand, as you mentioned earlier about mat leave, right? So you can't lecture Western women about having more children. So you literally have to bring them in, or you have to bring in women who are already pregnant or soon to be pregnant or will get pregnant in order to bolster up the population. And when they get to become, a little too Western, in terms of, ideas, values, and what have you, then, another population will have to be brought in, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. And, this creates a kind of a weakening effect on let's say the cohesion that one would expect in the military, or you're going to probably spend more money on policing your own country, which is another trend that we've seen developing in the last few decades. There's not less, there's more policing since 9/11. So yeah, I see these kind of trends where like this is a self-defeating proposition.
Wow, that actually turned into a bit of a longer discussion than I was originally anticipating. Now, granted, we covered some very good points there, but I did not expect a simple conversation about Navy budgets to turn to this. But again, no less, that's the beauty of the show. And you know what? Despite all that, at least we got that 4% GDP growth.
Yes.
Now, just to briefly touch on this before I get into some of the more serious news of the week, U.S. and South Korean delegates have met. Now, this includes the U.S. Deputy Representative for North Korea Policy, Alex Wong, and they're in sort of closed door, behind the scene meetings with South Korea. Now, this includes just normal U.S. South Korean relationships, such as military budgets, military cooperation, some of the stuff going on with the coronavirus, but mainly on policy for North Korea, because North Korea has come to an impasse. The last time there was a formal summit was actually around this time last year, with Trump ending it early. The last time we really got any progress, quote unquote, is when Trump and Kim were at the DMZ and met with each other. And of course, John Bolton was exiled to Mongolia, which I must mention every time I mention that story. What a beautiful sight. I mean, but Beyond that, there's really hasn't even been a escalation of threat where, look, the North Koreans will say what they always do. They'll come out there with the threat saying, oh, the lake of fire will turn you into a pile of ashes. But not even so much as that. It's just been radio silence on both sides. And they're hoping to really thaw out the negotiations here, which really, with some of the Iran stuff and just U.S. foreign policy in general, there isn't much motivation for North Korea to continue these negotiations, especially as relationship improves, as they're even reintegrated just into um, the Chinese markets, opening relations with Russia, probably Iran, even though there's not much talk about that. But even as they're sort of grafted into this alternative world order, I guess you call it, best term, I guess. But it seems like, especially with the nukes, there's really no motivation to even start the process or talks of denuclearization, as we've seen again with Iran policy and going back even further with Libya and Iraq. But I repeat myself there. And really, I don't expect things to change much with North Korea. I sort of expect this radio silence to continue so long as Trump is in office. I don't think that Trump or his administration will really touch the issue anymore. I don't think North Korea will make too much of a racket, except when they want to extract pretty much what amounts to a payoff from South Korea, whether that be in the form of actual money or food or some other resource. But the way things I see it, I see the situation with Korea sort of remaining as a peaceful stagnation or a relatively peaceful stalemate where neither side really approaches one another, but they don't antagonize each other either.
Yeah, I very much agree. Yeah, I don't see much changing there, and perhaps really the only country that wants to see change happen there more than the States is South Korea, and that doesn't look like it's going to happen. I think you know North Korea knows there's no future for itself by denuclearizing. That's just that's just a big mistake. We'll get into Syria and Libya later, which will exemplify this rather well. So, yeah, I think you know there it isn't really anything to worry about. I've always thought of North Korea. I said it way back when we first started doing shows, and that is that it's a bit of a crypto state. No one quite knows what's going on. There's all sorts of kind of conspiracy theories about why it's sort of has been able to endure for so long. Yeah, so I don't know really what to say about it, other than I don't think we're really going to hear a lot until the spring when Kim Jong Il will, fire a missile. Japan and South Korea will panic. Uh, Trump will give a phone call, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I can tell you what's going to happen. North
Mm.
Korea's scientists that definitely weren't kidnapped from Western countries or other East Asian countries are going to find the cure for the coronavirus, and that's going to give them big leverage in negotiations.
Wow.
You heard it here first, an official War
Yeah.
Report prediction. I being mildly facetious there, but yeah,
Yeah.
some of the Corona stuff I won't get into because not much has changed. Really, just more numbers have gone up, more people have died, but it seems to have slowed a bit now. The U.S. CDC was saying, well, we're preparing for a more severe outbreak, but again, not enough to really dedicate a segment to. I figured I'd just mention that in passing, but here's another thing I'll mention in passing because I feel like we've done the story a million times. Trump gives conditional go ahead on peace deal with Taliban, say officials. Now, the broad layout is if the Taliban can fulfill a promise to reduce violence, the United States would sign a deal that would begin the gradual withdrawal of American troops. Now, again, we've heard this ever since 2015. We heard this under Obama and his final years, of course, when he started the new mission in Afghanistan that completely undid all of that. We've heard this several times under Trump. In fact, the most recent time we thought we were going to get this, all of a sudden the Taliban staged an attack on U.S. forces. So I expect that again, but we discussed, I don't know, probably a month and a half ago at this point, that we may be trying to get at least mostly out of Afghanistan. Now, again, we're never going to get all the way out of Afghanistan until, looking at these recent budget constraints, it may come sooner than expected, but with, I would say, the current trajectory, it's going to be probably beyond our lifetimes that the U.S. is finally out of Afghanistan's hair. Now, whether that be in the form of regular troops, mercenaries, whatever, I think you get the point.
Yeah.
But I'm still thinking that the U.S. is expecting some sort of a boil over in Afghanistan, and they don't want to be engaged in another full-scale war in that country. Uh, that's my prediction, at least. I see some U.S. troops leaving, even if it's just for Trump's campaign stunt, saying, "Look at these troops coming home," sort of how he did the State of the Union, bringing out the the. I think he came home from Afghanistan, seeing his family. It's going to be stuff like that, and you're going to see the campaign ads with those kind of things on them. And again, it's probably going to be a significant withdrawal, but not enough to change the course of U.S. foreign policy, especially policy in Afghanistan, Central Asia as a whole. But I figured that was worth at least mentioning in passing because this may be the one in a million chance that it actually gets done, but I wouldn't hold my breath.
Yeah, I would have to wholeheartedly agree. I think it's just not a place that's really worth even like considering as a potential hotspot at the moment. I just don't see it. If anything, I would see, possibly more problems after whenever that happens, if that happens, a reunification.
Yeah, yeah, they'll find some justification staying there. I expect them to half pivot, saying, "Well, it's sort of like what they did in Syria, that we must stay in Syria because of Iranian influence. We must stay in Afghanistan. We've defeated the Taliban. We've come to a peace with them. But our troops have to stay to make sure Russia and China don't incur on Afghanistan's sovereignty," or some canned excuse like that.
Yeah, it's kind of. I read a headline today about how America, although its numbers are decreasing in Syria, is still there protecting the oil. Like, oh God, like, are you for real? It's still there protecting the oil. The oil. Whose oil? Whose oil would that be?
The Kurds' oil.
Yeah, so true.
Uh, how relevant have they become just in the past 3 months? That's something.
Hmm.
But I suppose we'll get into a bit of European news before hitting the main subject. Now, Merkel may be looking at an early retirement. Now, she already said that she would not be seeking re-election and pass the party reins down to her successor come the election in September of 2021. But the successor she had picked out has also pretty much up and quit politics, which people are speculating, especially after some state elections in Germany. I think Thungren or something like that was one of them. Some states in like southern Germany and eastern Germany were generally more conservative than northwestern Germany. Sort of like a microcosm of Europe. Funny how that works. Uh, may see the CDU, the so-called Christian Democratic Union, even though it's no more than just your typical social democratic party found in any given European country, may see an early exit. And I said this when the news first came out that Merkel would be stepping down after what would amount to 16 years, especially after her shaking events at two different state summits. I believe the one was in Ukraine, and I think the other one was at a meeting with Macron. But point being is, she was visibly shaking. She looked unwell. She looked dehydrated,
Hmm.
and just
Hmm.
sickly in general. My speculation would be that again, it's probably her health is the reason she's stepping down, and with again their underperformance and arguably defeat in some of these regional elections, seeing her successors and her pretty much inner circle sort of leaving politics and taking a back seat. That this may force an early election in Germany. Now, keep in mind they have that parliamentary system. It's very likely. And now the way that would go, funny enough, it seems like in these regional elections, no matter where they are in Germany, it's always Link and the Greens, which are the left wing parties, and the ADF, which are getting it. And we may finally see that hard left and hard right combine in one coalition and start the Nazbol revolution. Now, I severely doubt that, but fun thing to note is the hard left party in Germany, the Link Party, is actually made up of former East German communist officials. So it's definitely out of step with a lot of other Western European hard left parties, like someone like a Corbyn. Now his economics may be hard left, but his social policies are just like liberal, neoliberal. Same with a lot of these people, like for example in France and other Western European countries. But it would be interesting to see a rise in the German hard left, considering the fact a lot of these people are former top brass of the Communist Party of East Germany. So, but again, that's a side note. But overall, I wouldn't put my money on it, but it wouldn't hit me out of nowhere if an election was forced in Germany sometime this year.
It's possible. I have my doubts, mainly because of the freak out that happened with Merkel for this recent election, where the AfD basically played the role of a kingmaker. And I think it was the CDU. Who was it? And there's also the ADF. And I forget which one it was, but essentially, what they protested the most was how could they allow the AfD to become a kingmaker like this, in order to decide, which party would reign. And of course, the nominee that was chosen had to step down. And then, as you said, one of Merkel's ministers has also stepped down now. I honestly don't think they could ever allow it. They would. I mean, I don't know how it's going to play out, but I think I imagine one more event like this with the AfD, and I think I don't know what. Like, they'll have to introduce, quite honestly, like a program that even more effectively monitors what people are saying and thinking, outlining the AfD, like creating a draft, describing which parties are never to be allowed in German politics, and so on and so on.
Yeah, and with Germany's anti-extremist laws, they could, I wouldn't say very easily, but there's definitely more of an avenue than most Western countries say, well, the AfD, they're practically a neo-Nazi party, which is illegal under German law. I could see them doing that, framing some ADF leader with Nazi memorabilia or some garbage like that. Again, the creased swastika banner just found all of a sudden nowhere in the top ADF official's office. We have to shut down the party. I could very easily see something like that happening. Now, I think it would take a bit more of a boiling point, a bit more polarization in Germany. Not that Germany's politics are not polarized as it is. It's actually funny, a lot of people overlook, especially in the West, how polarized German politics are, especially region by region. And I wouldn't say I would expect a balkanization. Like, I don't expect the Bavarians to form their own state as much as, as good as a thing I'd honestly think that'd be at this point. But yeah, Germany's up there when it comes to political polarization in Western countries. But yeah, like I said, I wouldn't expect it anytime soon. But if things keep on going the trajectory they're going, the ADF and these other anti-establishment parties start gaining popularity, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw they're bordering close to extremism and neo-Nazism. I think we need to do some investigations, which, we kind of see in Italy with Salvini, which we'll get into in a minute.
Right. I mean, they wouldn't use the term Nazi, but effectively it would be some kind of a term, or maybe they'll incorporate the word natalist, or anyhow, how this could be, for instance, viewed as a threat to, let's say, the EU or European integration, or just, the social fabric, and so on and so on. Um, yeah, quite honestly, I think if it came down to it, they would do that. No, I have no doubt about it.
Uh, yeah, like I said, and in that case, I don't think you'd get that now, but you may see more regionalist parties rising up in Germany. Like again, I know there's they call not to get too far tangent, but Bavaria the Texas of Germany, and sort of it has that independent streak, one of the more conservative parts of the country. But I could see them definitely uh, gaining more of a regional consciousness if something like that happens, and even in again some of these other East German states and Southern German states that yeah, you may see even more polarization. Not, like I said, not that Germany isn't polarized already, especially compared to a lot of other Western European countries. Still a rather large one, and one with a again much less unified history. But yeah, as popular as I think the ADF may be among a significant sect of the population, I think it's the establishment, especially in Germany, that's been occupied by the United States and the liberal empire since the end of World War II. In fact, is the reason the liberal empire exists and their occupation is sort of paramount in that. I don't see that happening in Germany of all countries.
Yeah. Quite honestly, the boiling point that I see happening is probably 10 years from now, when people Merkel's age will be dead. So when the boomer generation starts dying off, and people in their 20s right now will be in their 30s, and most likely there'll be at least one more massive wave of migrants, uh, that's when I would suspect things to really begin heating up. Um, a lot of this, like you say, this is the post World War II. Well, Merkel, Biden, all these people are from that generation, and it's really once they start dying off that there'll be a slight opening in the door for different ideas that will address actual grievances. That neoliberalism will not be able to effectively condemn through moral speak, through moral condemnation and moral framing.
Yeah, and that goes back to the idea of like again, neoliberal has become the secular religion where you have to accept these truths as infallible when really like there's really nothing to back them up, and it's right because they say they're right and that the neoliberals are the current establishment. But yeah, especially as the decade goes on, as we see them step out of politics and of course die off, that's really like you said. There's going to be a foot in the door. We're probably going to see it from again the hard left and the hard right as we've been seeing. And I think a lot of people think thought that things like 2016 or like the midterm elections or like the late teens were the boiling point when honestly that's just where it's getting started because all these groups, no matter how much the media fearmongers or how much people on Twitter talk about, oh, our revolution of X niche ideology is going to take over. No, it has just begun. And I'm not saying I expect massive war or anything, but if you're looking for social strife, in the United States, I would say 2024 as Trump leaves office, which coincidentally enough will be when Putin also leaves office, and when a lot of these old guard European leaders and their systems they created will either be stepping down or dying off. And like I said,
Mhm.
in Germany of all places, where this sort of all began with the end of World War II and the occupation of Germany, that's gonna be very telling. And of course, I don't know the fate of U.S. German relations now. I know that not much changed under Trump despite all his bluster, but yeah, the fate of U.S. troops in that country and really its role and, of course, its relationship with Russia. But I think people write Germany off as, oh, it's just occupied by the U.S. It's sort of been, um, you know, ground to dust, which, in many ways is true. But yeah, uh, that could very rapidly change in just 4 or 5 years from now. But moving on from that to the other sort of epicenter of the neoliberal world order, with Italy, one of the other defeated Axis powers, the Italian Senate has voted to allow Salvini to be tried by the courts. Now, Salvini, when this vote came up, he said even to his own party members, to his party allies, saying, "Well, let me do it." Now the words he used were, "I'm sure the courts will see the light," even though I think knowing him and knowing his sort of like publicity stunt things, he's willing to make something of a martyr from himself. Now, I don't think they're going to use a recent example from the United States. I don't think they're going to give him the Roger Stone treatment. I think they're going to drag him through the courts. I think they're going to try to make a publicity stunt out of this. But I don't think they're in the position to throw him in a cell for 10 years. Now, I say that because, look, the Italian government is unstable as it is. The courts, of course, are on the side of the establishment with the PD and the Five Star Movement, which, again, their coalition is hanging on by a thread. I don't think they can afford to jail a major political figure or even give some sort of harsh punishment without the whole thing topping off and the collapse of their government. Now, for all I know, with the direction their government's going, by the time this actually makes it to the courts, makes it to trial, which the trial is for kidnapping because he closed the ports and detained ships that were there illegally before releasing them. So wrap your head around that one. But especially within Liga, within the other political parties and political movements Salvini's allied himself with, and just the Italian populace in general. They may not like Salvini, they may see him as a bit of a clownish figure, which in many ways he is, but ultimately, when it comes down to it, they are more sympathetic to him than they are to the establishment that's been running their country since the end of World War II, with the dysfunctional democracy, with the upwards of 70 different governments, 70 different administrations since the end of the war. I think they're more apt to side with, again, this guy who's anti-establishment, who they may not like on everything, but ultimately is more in line with them than not. But as I said today, I think I can get away with this. Um, I could see this leading to the Dago riots.
Yeah, this is a kind of assertion. It's kind of like Merkel's outrage. I think they sense that there is some massive and unavoidable change that's going to start to accelerate in the next 10 years. It's kind of like the right wing vote amongst white males that has happened in the last 3-4 years. We've seen like a 7.5 shift towards the Republican Party, and Merkel's outrage in really, like, to me it sounds unprecedented, stopping this political process only because the party she didn't like simply performed their duties as any other party would. And with Salvini, I think this is probably going to ignite the Italians far worse. I would look for, like a very slow trial process, only because they would rather exhaust the population in this. I'm being quite serious. If this was done very swiftly, let's say within a week or two, he was reprimanded. It works out very negatively for him. He's barred from parliament, and so on and so on and so on. Then, there would be a very quick counteraction by the public. However, I think if they drag this on, which is possible, I think they would do it simply because it would, in hopes that the population would lose interest. And again, why? Because, well, in Italy's recent elections, the right made gains.
Yeah.
I mean, they understand this trajectory. Like, I've seen articles that point out that this trajectory has been going on since at least 2008, 2009. Like, they're well aware of it. So they know it's, this trajectory is anywhere from 10 to 15 years old.
I mean, even with someone like Berlusconi, despite all the criticism and corruption you can rightly so point out about him, he was still a shift in that direction, at least in the Italian context. And yeah, you know what? I think it's going to come down to it. He needs to pick either Hungary or Russia or one of these other countries that's more sympathetic to him, and he needs to establish his government in exile. Maybe he can crash with Yanukovych. I wonder what he's up to these days.
Oh no! Ouch, bro. That's harsh.
Oh, but in all seriousness, like I said, I agree with you. They're going to make it a long and slow trial process where ultimately he probably will get off very lightly to avoid outrage. But again, if they're gonna, I suppose metaphorically or maybe literally in this sense, who knows at this point, send him to the gallows, it's gonna make the Yellow Vest look like a joke, especially with the temperament, with the culture in Italy compared to France, compared to a lot of other European countries. Again, we may get the. I'm probably pushing it with the second time. I think can probably get away with two times, but we're definitely going to get the Dago riots in that case. But I do have to say, credit where credit is due to the current Italian government. They are wise. Now, I don't know whether this is their own moves or whether they're being fed them from Brussels or one of these other power centers. They've made the right moves where, of course, the Italian people are angry with them, but to the point where they won't go out and riot. Because, again, they've been very tactful about this in their attacks on the right, and I think, again, the right wing victories have probably done a little bit to pacify the population, but this isn't going anywhere. They realize it, and ultimately, this is sort of their last ditch effort where if they can do this just right, they may be able to take some wind out of the sails, delay it by a few years, but ultimately it's a very risky gamble because, yeah, they may be able to destroy Salvini's political career, in which case you'd make him a martyr, or they could do it quickly and end up with a pissed off, just completely uncooperative, like a Yellow Vest situation on their hands. So they've weaseled themselves into a position where really the chances of them botching this, as in the liberal establishment in Italy, is much higher than most. But again, I think it's kind of their last ditch effort. It's not like they're going to have many other chances to take this guy down aside from a neoliberal military coup, which those are few and far between. Oh yeah, seizing control of your country in the name of international capital. I'm sure. Okay, maybe there'll be some generals on board with that, but I'm getting off on tangent here. But definitely they have weaseled themselves in a position where this is sort of the last thing they can do to diffuse this sort of populist wave. But again, it's likely not to happen. And even if Salvini's political career is destroyed, again, he's going to be the martyr. He's going to be, even outside of politics, somebody who's still an influential figure, whether that be his successor within Lega or one of these other right wing parties, or somebody, one of his protege comes up, or whoever the leader of the FDI party is. But you're going to get somebody who takes his place and is inspired by him and quotes him, and you're probably going to get him again being at least a major influential figure, probably like someone in the background outside of politics. Probably get some sort of media gig at one of these media outlets. I'm not too familiar with the Italian language media outlets, but I think again the best case scenario is they defang him and he becomes a leader outside of politics. The worst case scenario is they start full scale riots in every major city in their country.
Right, and it would be interesting to see what would happen if it appears they're going for the slow route, and the protests become very intense. Nonetheless, then they'll have to make a decision whether to speed it up or slow it down, or maybe acquit him.
You know,
That would be a really good scenario.
yeah, it definitely would be. And honestly, I care much more about this in one day than any emotions I had about the whole Trump impeachment for its entirety over those 2.5 months.
Yeah.
I think this is much bigger. I think it has the potential to have much larger consequences, no matter how it goes, no matter what way it goes, than Trump's impeachment and acquittal, or even Trump got okay. Maybe if Trump got removed from office, would be something. But again, it's this is, in my opinion, for the political climate of the Western world as a whole, and populism and sort of the direction things are going, the revolt against liberalism. I would say this is a much bigger deal.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of people in Italy maybe expect that Salvini in 10 years might become prime minister.
You know,
Um,
I have an idea. I think here's what Salvini should do. He needs to get some guys, get them in nice sleek uniforms. I don't know, maybe a darker color, and about 1 million of them, and just go to Rome one day. That may have been done before. I don't know. It's escaped me, but I don't know. I think that probably has a pretty good chance of succeeding.
yes.
Uh, Salvini, Mussolini. Oh God, I sound like a leftist now. But I mean, tell me, Mussolini if only Mussolini had an ounce of the charisma that man has.
Yeah.
The cameras just love him. He's just, again, he's a bit of a clownish figure, but in a good way. And uh, people do rag on him for Zionist things, which, in my opinion, we'll get into this definitely towards the end of the show, which we're probably cutting it a bit close. Should probably get into that next. For energy reasons, with some of this new pipeline stuff going on, but we'll go into Syria real quick, and then we'll finish out the show with some stuff on the uh, debacle in Libya and how convoluted that has gotten. But things have really heated up in Syria. So as you were saying, I believe it was the M5 highway they completely secured for the first time in 8 years, and this has led to in the battle in the greater Idlib area to not only Syrian troops engaging Turkish-backed forces, but regular Turkish military forces. There's been exchanges. There's been casualties inflicted on both sides. Syrian helicopters have been down, and this is the most tense I would say it has been since the Israeli strikes of 2018. Since that week leading up to the American strikes. This is probably the most tense it's been in Syria in years, to the point where the potential for conflict, again, is probably the highest since it's been since, I don't know, 2013, 2014.
Yeah. You know, Turkey is losing actual troops. These aren't just Turkmen. They're not just Al Sham fighting on their behalf and so on with artillery cover from the Turkish army. Um, 5 just got killed a few days ago. Another 14 were killed either today or yesterday. Uh, this isn't to say that Syria hasn't lost a few dozen itself. It has. However, tanks have been destroyed, and these are like T-160s that are kind of sort of outside, but related to some of the late Patton tanks that were being created in the 60s and 70s. The one that at least one of them that got knocked out is an Israeli variant that the Turks modernized with more protection and a more powerful gun and so on. I'm actually surprised that things are still holding in place, but I think they're beginning to unravel. And what we might see, what we've witnessed for the last 4 years has been, maybe 4.5, it has been a kind of departure for several countries, most notably Turkey, from which position or side that they've usually taken with regards to America and NATO. And what we're seeing is maybe the potential for those units to go back to the sides that they were originally on back in 2014 and 15. There's a real potential for that. Up until now, we've seen Israel basically bombing what are apparently Iranian forces, but half the time they're actually Syrian forces. And Iranian forces are still operating, and they're part of the units that are fighting in that southwestern pocket just outside the city of Aleppo. And they, along with Hezbollah, have been basically along, and with the Syrian army, but they've been really strong strategic partners that have allowed to the recapture of the M5. But Turkey has answered in kind by setting up fortifications around Idlib city. This is absolutely the last stronghold that the various jihadis, moderate beheaders, call them what you will, have. There is no other city that they have that's anywhere nearly in scope and size or in influence. We're seeing more massive amounts of people leaving, going into Turkey. Turkey has anti-aircraft missiles. No surprise to why the Syrian helicopter got knocked out. But Syria has not lost any grounds. They've managed to thwart two attempps to retake Sarab, which was which is that city that is located where the M4 meets the M5. Maybe the most important thing now is Aleppo and Damascus will have a highway, so they'll be able to transport everything from, economic goods, resources, military staff, back and forth quite easily. That's very pivotal, and it's creating a choke point for Idlib, including Idlib, the city. So, but long term, what does this mean, especially with regards to Russia? Putin right now has been able to kind of make himself to a degree, the kingmaker, or at least the top diplomat, or even a decision maker to some degree in Syria, to a limited degree. He's tried sort of ways to keep everyone happy, but no one to get really everything that they want. At least that's what the results would show. However, there's no condemnation. I'm very sure he's assisting Assad and the other forces like Hezbollah that are fighting in order to retake Idlib.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure
And at the
Russian air forces have been active in this
oh yeah,
most
yeah,
recent push.
they've flown over like 240 sorties the last 4 or 5 days. They've done a massive. None of these cities would have been retaken without Russian air support. However, they're still trying to work with the Turks to continue the patrol in that Kurdish-dominated area in northern Syria. So how's that going to go? And just today, American military personnel shot and killed a Kurdish boy that was blocking the path of American military personnel in their vehicles.
At least the oil fields are safe.
At least the oil field, they're safe. They're so safe right now.
Believe me, the safest they've ever been.
Yeah, believe me, beautiful oil fields, the best oil fields. How long how long can this be juggled? When does the war in the Kurdish-dominated area become the same war that's in Idlib? Last week, Russia had another face-off with American forces. This time around, after the Kurdish boy was killed, Russia came in and basically de-escalated the situation between Kurdish groups and Americans. So I mean, America is losing its, to some degree, it's losing its status with America. The Kurds are losing. America's losing its status with the Kurds, and that's going to make the reason for why America has to be there even more and more tenuous.
It's actually funny. Well, funny is perhaps not the right word, but it's actually interesting how this is all playing out with the residual American forces there. Of course, protecting those great big oil fields. We're actually seeing the scenario that Colonel Douglas McGregor, of course, get that um, obligatory mention in, said would play out. He said that yeah, as if American forces left, we would probably see a lot of infighting with all the other factions in Syria that had been united previously with some of the progress of Turkey, with Syria and Russia and the Kurds. And now that American forces are there, but effectively they might as well not be there. I mean, they serve as nothing more than a tripwire in his defense for the oil fields, but in terms of American power projection, they're completely irrelevant. We're sort of seeing that scenario slowly but surely play out, and again, it sort of does put a hole in the narrative of why American troops need to be there. And at this point, I mean, Trump has pretty much outright said it. We need to protect those oil fields, which of course are the Kurdish oil fields, which in that case, you figure they would have been handed over to the Kurdish authorities, but no, they would hand them over to the Syrian authorities. We can't have that. But I do think it's interesting that out of all of this, one of the biggest things that came out of this is it showed the complete irrelevance of the American presence in Syria.
Yeah, I mean, the American presence is literally just helping to fuel the problem. This war would have resolved itself much more quickly if America had done nothing, which only makes me miss Obama even more. Um, yeah, and maybe that's why, just to round this out, why America is actually there, and that is probably it's providing some logistical support for some groups vis-a-vis Turkey and support for Turkey, and it's probably waiting for these various factions to kind of unravel and go back to the positions prior to 2016.
Now, I have actually a bit of a long shot theory. I'm not saying I subscribe to this, but I'm still just going to put it out there anyway. Now, of course, after the S 400 and some of the other disputes between the U.S. and Turkey, U.S. sanctions are expected to take effect on Turkey in the coming months. I'm curious as if these recent Turkish moves, now that they don't have their own interest in all this, but maybe the U.S. is leaning on them to sort of put their foot down more in Idlib, in these areas that where the Russian Syrian forces are operating, in exchange for some sort of easing of sanctions or dropping them altogether.
Mm. It's an interesting idea. I mean, it's possible.
And of course, that's all compounded with Erdogan's slipping domestic sport.
Right, right. It doesn't seem like it's there's a very good future for Turkish and American prospects, not just right now. And like I said last week, where in a way America isn't helping Turkey because it wants Turkey to do this. It doesn't want to be seen as an aggressor. I don't think Trump can afford it right now to look like an aggressor in Syria because he knows that his base does not want to go to Syria.
He knows that the independents don't want to go to war in Syria. And he knows that the Democrats, even though as much as they love war in Syria, they're going to campaign on him against that because it's an election year.
Right.
But you want to move on to the disaster in Libya, which, seeing as we pushed a bit late, I'll try to be succinct with it as possible, which, again, this will probably be a reoccurring topic, and we'll probably focus on this a lot in our very next episode. But in January of this year, there was a meeting called the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum that included Greece, Italy, Cyprus, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. And this was to extract those vital oil and gas fields that were all of a sudden just recently discovered in Israel, even though they've probably been sitting on them for 4 or 5 years and have just waited for their time to pounce. And this has led to some friction with Turkey. Now, Turkey claims that this violates both their territorial waters and the territorial waters of the UN backed GNA government in Libya, which they have an alliance with. So they're doing that and they're trying to prevent the energy flow. Now, let's just clarify I don't think this has much to do with Turkstream because Turkstream is more about the Balkans and Central Europe and Hungary, Slovakia, that sort of area, and
Mhm.
through Bulgaria. But it definitely, again, it's definitely an energy war. It's definitely an energy dispute, and it may sound very straightforward at first. This coalition of countries wants to build a pipeline. Turkey doesn't because they think it will undercut their territorial waters. But it gets more complex. As I said, Libya is backing the GNA, which is also against this deal. These countries that I just listed, including Egypt, are backing the LNA, which are General Haftar's forces in Libya. And they're on board with this. They're okay with the pipeline going through their territorial waters. And here's what it gets really complicated. Russia is also backing the LNA, despite the fact that a new pipeline coming in through southern Europe would definitely undercut their energy prospects. Now, it wouldn't break the Russian monopoly in, for example, northern Europe with Denmark and Germany with the Nord Stream 2. Again, with the Turk Stream into the Balkans, with Bulgaria through the Balkans up to Hungary, even France, arguably. But it would dispute their energy monopoly over Southern Europe over these countries like Greece and Italy, which they haven't had too much of an established energy contracts with, not as much as other European countries, but they were there. But I don't know. They apparently don't seem too threatened with this by the fact that they're still on board with the LNA. Now maybe they just cast their lots with the LNA and it's too late to pull out. But this is one of the most confusing scenarios I've ever seen in my time doing the show and my time just following global politics in general, where you have Russia, it seems, undermining their own interests. Now, of course, countries undermining their own interests isn't anything new if you live in the West, but with a country with as much wiggle room as Russia, say, and no real foreign influence on that, it does seem a bit odd. Now, again, maybe this is a concession they're willing to make in order to stabilize Libya because they have some other further vested interests. Now, of course, Erdogan, on top of wanting to prevent his territorial waters being violated and this new energy deal, Turkey and Turkish companies are also invested in the reconstruction of Libya, whether that be just regular infrastructure, whether that be energy infrastructure, which I think is mainly looking at this. And we're seeing considerations by the French, the Italians, the Greeks, and the Cypriots, of course not the Israelis, on actually putting peacekeeping forces in LNA controlled Libya to help stabilize the situation. Now, I can only wonder why the IDF wouldn't pull their weight in this one, but that's nothing new. But I mean, I don't think, again, from what I know about these energy fields, like I said, I don't think it's enough to completely undercut Russia there, but it'll definitely put a little bit of hurt on them. But like I said, between their deals in Northern Europe, the Balkans, and again now into China and Asia, it shouldn't affect them much. Which, look, maybe if they didn't do that deal with China and some other Asian countries, they'd be more concerned about this, more concerned about meeting their bottom line. But for all we know, that could be the one factor that bailed them out of being in quite the pickle in this situation, where they sort of take the hands-off role. Because the Russians haven't said anything about this new pipeline or said anything about Turkey's moves. They've stayed quiet in all this, which is very surprising for an energy dispute. Now, we didn't have the time to talk about Belarus today, but we'll probably touch on that next week. Which, yeah, I mean, the big thing between Russia and Belarus and Russia and Ukraine for a while was energy disputes, and Russia and Poland, energy disputes. There's a common theme when it comes to Russia and energy disputes, but this thing in Libya, even minus the Russia situation, is one of the most complex situations I've ever seen.
Right. I think. I mean, here's what I think is happening is that, if you remember a few months ago, back in 2019, Putin went to Saudi Arabia Uh, he's working with the Saudis in one way or another already for energy needs. Saudi Arabia is tentatively on the LNA. There's just more people that there's just more countries, more important people that are on his side, including France,
And
which I'm
also,
sure.
not to get too far off track, but if Israel's in on this energy deal, I can almost guarantee you the United States is going to drop their what amounts to tentative support for the GNA and completely get on board with Haftar because Israel's okay with Haftar, and this would be an energy deal that benefits, of course, Israel, and we all know how intertwined American and Israeli policy are. So you could see pretty much every major power in the world, from France to most European countries to Russia to the United States to Saudi Arabia, be on Haftar's side to the point where Turkey's really the only country that has any weight to throw around supporting the GNA.
Right, it is looking that way. The majority of the Gulf states are on the LNA side. Uh, France being on the side, especially considering Macron's work and Macron um, trying to smooth over some of the issues that Poland has had with the EU and Poland's relationship to Russia. Uh, I think that's what is basically. This is a diplomatic move on behalf of Russia. It is to be on the right side. Ultimately, it's there to give them some amount of leverage, especially in Syria. Uh, they're not going to build a pipeline anytime soon in the Mediterranean. Turkstream is already complete. Um, Russia's trade with Turkey is only going up, and Russia has a sizable trade, including with Israel, which is roughly around $5 billion a year. Uh,
Funny enough, I think Russia actually trades more with Israel than the U.S. does. So, yeah,
yeah,
there's your proof of Putin being in the Zionist pocket.
busted.
Oy gewalt.
So, so yeah. So I think it's a basically diplomatic move. I think they're smelling to see. Rather, he's smelling to see, where I think the victory will be and who are the important sides to take. But that's how I see it. Maybe he's also reading the lack of America's concern with Turkey's fate in Syria, the impending sanctions. I don't think he sees much of a roadblock.
I have a bit of an out there theory, but with Russia's experience building pipelines, of course, for decades now, I could see Russian companies swooping in saying, "Well, we have expertise in this field. Now, we would be more than willing to join if there's something in it for us." I could see, especially with someone like Putin, especially with the way the Russian government has functioned for the past 20, 30 years, them pulling that move right there. Now, I'm not saying that will happen, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Right. He could offer that. Of course, the main obstacle of that would be that America would bring sanctions on any company that even dared try it.
Yeah, which would complicate things because that would possibly, in a roundabout way, sanction Israel, which I guess the BDS crowd would finally get what they want through the most convoluted conflict that I've seen. Well, that has happened in decades that I know of.
Right. And for all we know, I mean, since the Arab-Israel wars from 67 and 72, there were several pipelines that I don't know what their effect is right now, but they were turned off as a protest. So Syria turned off many pipelines way, way back, over 50 years ago. Now, it's arguable that once, and maybe it seems still unimaginable, but once Syria settles down, there could be, a real push towards developing these pipelines. Russia could offer Turkey, could broker a deal between Turkey and Syria for pipelines originating out of Syria. That would also include Iran and the UAE. It's possible. I mean, that would be a feather in Putin's cap.
Also just to throw more complications onto this, of course, we've seen the U.S. try to compete with energy, compete in this energy war with Russia in Europe, specifically with Poland and Germany, even though to a lesser extent. But of course, as we said, if Israel's on board this pipeline, then America will end up being on board this pipeline, or at least the people who matter in America will end up being on board this pipeline. Well, that's also going to undercut American energy prospects in Europe to the point where that begs the question with someone like Trump, who's been so bombastic about American energy production and selling oil and gas to Europe. That's gonna bring two of Trump's biggest, I suppose, loyalties to head: his dedication to the energy industry and his dedication to the Zionist lobby. And watching the way this goes in the next 4 years, it's going to be
Hmm.
interesting. Assuming Trump stays in office, which I think at this rate, especially with some of the the shenanigans with the DNC and the Democratic primaries, is I would say upwards of an 80% chance or so. Now, of course, there's that small chance we could get Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg in office, but I'll leave that aside. Yeah, it's going to be interesting seeing two of the biggest influences on Trump going head to head.
Right. Also, if I'm not mistaken, a very big portion of America being able to, deliver energy to the world and so on, a lot of it is involving shale. Like, honestly, like, that's not like long term, you can't do that. Long term, that's not viable.
Yeah, I mean, the energy boom has been great for domestic energy production, but in terms of exports, I honestly don't know how our energy exports have been so high.
Right, right. Now, I think the shale market has kind of already begun to bottom out. So it would be interesting to find out how much of America's oil exports are dependent on shale, and I don't mean in a direct way necessarily. I mean like how much shale provides for domestic use, so that it can free up um America's non-shale oil exports.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I just want to say, if you thought American foreign policy was schizophrenic as it is, wait until there's a third player in the European energy market that Israel backs.
Right.
I mean, yeah, like I said, people in Europe, people even in the United States looking at American foreign policy, looking at Trump, thinking there's no coherence to this. It's only just begun.
Hmm.
But wow, we actually got through that more succinctly and quickly than I thought we would. But yeah, definitely, this is probably far from the last time we will discuss this topic. This is probably going to become the new Khashoggi for a long time viewers. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I don't know,
Right.
6 weeks in a row mentioning it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like we've spoken about this in some of the other episodes in reference to the amount of military hardware that Turkey is shipping to Libya, as well as literally flying out over 3,500 um, essentially Syrian-backed jihadis to Libya to bolster support for the GNA. That may be why they're less effective and why they want to use as little of their actual army, their actual Turkish soldiers in Syria, is because they're at a point now where they're divided between Syria and Libya, and things are not stacking up that great uh, in Libya so far. But like I agree with you, this subject is now heating up. It's always been on the boilerplate. We've referenced it from time to time, but it is going to heat up now, especially once a pipeline starts, uh, getting formatted and announced.
I gotta
Not to say nothing of the construction.
I gotta say the situation in with Turkey, with Syria and Libya Reminds me of those old cases you get like during the Middle Ages where a European king would have to wage a war to try to seize the throne of another country, but also, he had to protect his own throne. And I'm curious.
Hmm.
Like, I think it's going to be a situation where Turkey's either going to have to choose Libya or Syria, and I think maybe you go back to 2016, they would be Syria all the way, but I could see Turkey sort of calling it quits in Syria if it meant protecting their interests in Libya. But granted, I would say their interests in Libya are rockier, especially with the losing side that they're backing that has almost no international support compared to all the powers that back the LNA. They could put their foot down further in Syria, but point being is, I don't see a scenario where Turkey has the influence to prop up both of their groups in each country. I think it's going to come to the point where they either have to defend their interests in Libya, their energy interests in Libya, or strike back against the threat of a stronger Syria on their border that has more independence, which ultimately also goes back to energy deals. And I don't, I don't see a scenario where they can reasonably maintain their current policies in both.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. I think first of all, what are the benefits for Turkey controlling these parts of Syria, anyways? In terms of finance, very little to none. It's there to bolster his prestige in Turkey and elsewhere,
And it's a bargaining
but
chip.
right, and it's a bargaining chip. However, uh, his popularity is actually waning. Two, it's only created more discord with the U.S. Um, Sanctions are coming. The economy is going down. You saw how fast he buckled with that that fake ass preacher that they eventually released. Like how that guy was not a spy. Strunked out. However, you can see that the cause in Syria is it's kind of disintegrating. How many Kurdish attacks, YPG attacks, uh, have been going on in Turkey in the last 2 years? I mean, there were some very serious attacks that happened and counterattacks against Kurds in Turkey. Really horrible stuff where well in excess of 60, 70 people were killed. Um, but we haven't seen anything in roughly around 3 years or so. So, um, and I'm very sure Turkey has seen it all, and they're used to this violence, having episodes where it's dormant or non-existent, and then it flares up again, and so on and so on. And it will probably return eventually. But at the moment, there's nothing that's been going on for several years. Um, he's essentially losing the battle. He's not getting any support from any NATO members in a really effective way. Certainly not in a overt way. Uh, and his shift to Libya already indicates that maybe Syria is a sinking ship for him anyhow.
I think is the real important takeaway about this.
Mm.
No matter what, Vladov Putler wins.
That's right.
The liberals' worst nightmare.
Yes, yes.
But this has been
He
a.
did it again, folks. He did it again.
I don't know how the man does it. I mean,
Yeah.
between controlling Trump, controlling all European populace, manufacturing the coronavirus, now Libya and Syria.
Yeah.
I don't know how the man doesn't control the world. Like, those
Yeah.
old political cartoons about Russia means octopus. You thought those were a joke. You thought that was an exaggeration. My friend, they were not. But
And Brexit. You forgot Brexit.
of course, Brexit, especially Brexit, because we all know how much of a Russophile Boris Johnson is. I mean, his name's
His
Boris.
name is Boris, folks.
Oh boy. But I have a feeling with most of the topics we discussed, this will be far from the last that we discussed them. In fact, I have a bit of a feeling um, next week's episode is probably going to be a direct continuation of this week plus Belarus because there were some things we didn't have the time to cover there. But that's everything I think we can squeeze in for this week while staying within a reasonable time frame. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and goodbye.
Thank you.